Um, Johanna Weststar is an associate professor in the Department of Management and Organizational Studies at Western University in London, Ontario. Wonderful, wonderful town. Johanna will be speaking for approximately 25 minutes about the need to rebalance the rules of workplace governance. And I think this is going to really set the table for some wonderful discussions. We've also set aside 10 to 15 minutes after Professor Weststar's presentation for you Assembly members to interact directly with her with a Q&A. So I'd like to welcome Professor Weststar and thank you so much for joining us this morning and for addressing the Assembly.
Thank you very much, Richard. Really nice to be here. Thank you to you as the host, and also to Andrew and Professor Gomez for inviting me to, as Ms. Raitt says, a very, very important initiative. Andrew, Richard, I know you'll be sort of advancing some slides, so I have a couple images that come up maybe here and there, but I'll just try to give you a cue when it's time to move ahead. Thank you so much for facilitating
Absolutely.
that. So hi folks, I'm really honored to be here with you today and to help you kick off your very important and really exciting work. I know it's a Saturday morning, but I found it just a pleasure to be here because it is such a really great initiative. And I wanted to kind of set the stage for my comments by just introducing myself a little bit and how I came to the study of worker voice. And you'll see that kind of segues right into your topic, because the research that I do at Western University is really in this topic area. So I was born and raised in Eastern Ontario. I grew up in a town just outside of Gananoque, which is in the Thousand Islands area. And I'm actually headed there today to visit my parents. And as Richard said, now I live in London, Ontario with my husband and 2 kids and 2 cats. And we've been here for about 10 years. We moved to London when I got the job at the University of Western Ontario. But before that, I actually lived in Halifax for 4 years because that's where I got my first job as a professor at St. Mary's University. And I would say that I grew up in a household of labor activism. My dad is a retired postal worker and my mom is a retired teacher. So they were both members of unions, and members of unions that have a history of being militant, we might say, or not afraid to take actions. My dad in the Canadian Union of Postal Workers and my mom in the Elementary Teachers Union of Ontario. And I remember distinctly one time as a kid when we were at the kitchen table making signs for the picket line because they were actually both going to be on strike at the same time, which was perhaps a unique experience. But I learned from them that workers aren't in control in the workplace. I remember once that my dad didn't go to work for a few days. And it turns out that he was actually suspended for disagreeing with his boss. So my dad felt that his boss was asking the workers to do things that actually interfered with their ability to do their jobs well. My mom had similar stories of being a teacher. She really just wanted to do great work in the classroom and with her students. She just wanted to teach. She just wanted to be a teacher. But she found over the years that she was getting more and more bogged down with the administrative side of the work that was sometimes mandated by the school board or by the Ministry of Education. So this is not to say in any way that my parents were always right and that their bosses were always wrong. Very far from that. Certainly my dad could be a hothead and I would not want to be his boss. But early in my life, I came to learn that there are different perspectives in the workplace. Workers have a perspective that's very close to the work and they know that work intimately. And much of the time, workers quite like their jobs. They feel quite fulfilled by their work and they really want to be able to do the work as best they can. They're the ones who often know the work the best, but they rarely have a say in how the work is done. And that can make workers feel disenfranchised. It can make them feel frustrated sometimes, and sometimes it can cause conflict in workplaces. So now as a professor, my main area of study is workers who make video games. Quite a unique population. And for years, I've written about 2 things. The first thing is how passionate these workers are about their jobs and about making games. They want to make the very best video games possible. They put their heart and soul into it. But the second thing that I've written a lot about is how the work is really taking its toll on them, because the industry exploits their passion. It creates an environment where game developers work very long hours, sometimes for weeks at a time, and often receive no overtime pay, and they don't have really good job security either. And I've interviewed game developers who tell me that they love the industry and they don't want to leave it, but they want to make it a better place to work. So they want to stay and make change. And that brings us to the core concept of your study group, which is worker voice. And Richard, if you don't mind going to the next slide now, that would be super. Thanks so much. So the definition of worker voice, and I know you've been provided with lots of excellent information in your preparation package, and hopefully none of what I say is out of line with that package. But the definition of worker voice in a simple way is the capacity of workers to influence decisions and have a say in solving problems at work. So that seems simple enough as a sentence, but what do we mean by have a say? What does this look like in practice? Right? What do we mean by the capacity for workers? How do workers get that capacity in a workplace? And what do we mean by influence decisions? Well, what decisions? What issues? To what degree of influence? So just reflecting on that and kind of looking out at the landscape of different workplaces, we can think of different ways that workers can have a say. You probably, if I gave you 5 minutes, could write a whole bunch of these things down just from the top of your head, right? Workers, of course, can speak directly to their managers. Managers will often say that they have an open door policy to speak to workers at any time that there are issues or concerns. Sometimes you can think about workplaces where employers and managers have set up things like a suggestion box, or maybe they send out employee surveys every once in a while or on specific topics that they would like to get feedback on from workers. Ms. Raitt just mentioned town halls, right? Sometimes, like governments do, workplaces have town halls where managers can give information to workers and workers can ask questions in those spaces or state opinions. We can also think about worker voice in teams or work groups, right? Maybe you've had these experiences yourself at the job where a team that you're on is actually given quite a bit of decision-making authority or autonomy in how you might decide to plan your work or carry out your work. And really the employer is really interested in the outcome. You know, they just want to see the work is done. They don't care so much how the work is done. And so workers can have more discretion there. That's a form of voice as well. More formalized voice we can see in things like maybe joint labor management committees that might make decisions in the workplace. And a really good example of that are joint occupational health and safety committees that are actually mandated by law in Ontario in workplaces with over 20 employees. And these committees have worker and employer representatives that are tasked with a mutual commitment and obligation to improve health and safety in the workplace. So that's one example of those, but really a workplace could set up a joint labor management committee on any topic that it wanted. And then of course, some workers are part of unions, which engage in formalized negotiations with the employer, and they set down the outcomes of those negotiations in a contract called a collective agreement. So just even this list shows you that worker voice can take a lot of different forms. Right? We can have individual voice. We can also have collective voice. We can have voice that is more employer controlled, like suggestion boxes or the employee surveys. And we can have voice that is maybe not worker controlled, but at least gives more power or agency to workers, perhaps like the joint labor management committees, or more so in unions where workers are more of an equal player. We can have forms of direct voice where Me as a worker, I have a direct say in how I do my day-to-day tasks. And then we could have indirect or representational voice. And that's what unions are like, where workers have a system to engage in collective decision-making amongst themselves. And then they have representatives that take those viewpoints forward to the employer. We also know that worker voice can take a unitarist or a pluralist form. And so what I mean by that is with unitarist, the emphasis is on the beginning of that word, uni, singular, one. So a unitarist form assumes that workers and employers have shared goals or one perspective. And often the voice mechanism there directs worker voice towards collaborating to achieve those shared or unitary goals. Whereas a pluralist form is plural, many. It recognizes that there are multiple perspectives in the workplace, not just the employers, and those multiple perspectives are acknowledged. And so a pluralist form can give more space for dissenting opinion or conflicting views. And when pluralism is allowed, worker voice can actually sometimes prohibit what employers or managers might do or might want to do on certain things. So worker voice manifests then in different ways, and not all of those ways are created equal, as we would say. That means we need to think about and analyze these different forms of voice to figure out which ones are the most genuine, which ones best allow workers to be able to speak up and be able to be heard. And that's the middle section of the slide that you're looking at there, this idea of genuine voice. Genuine voice mechanisms allow workers to express opinions and preferences about their jobs and workplaces. They can protect workers against unfair, unacceptable, or dangerous conditions and decisions because workers can speak up against them. And they allow workers to advocate for desired change. Because voice is fundamentally constructive in nature. It has a purpose. There is an end goal to having voice. It's not just venting or complaining with your colleagues around the water cooler, although of course that happens in workplaces all the time and has its own costs and benefits. But voice is also not just a scenario where workers kind of toss their opinions out into the world and hope they get picked up. It's a very important component of voice that to be effective and genuine, that voice must be connected to a process whereby the views of workers are received, considered, and to at least some degree acted upon. So there is an action coming out of the voice mechanism. But the question is how to best set up a system where the views of workers are received, considered, and acted upon by employers and managers. Okay. In thinking about that, we have to recognize that a system that ensures that managers and employers receive, consider, and act upon the views of workers by necessity gives workers more power and more agency in the workplace. And we see that workers who have more agency or power often have greater say in their workplace, even without a voice mechanism. It's a bit of a reinforcing system there, or a virtuous circle. But of course, the idea of giving more voice, the idea of giving more power and agency to workers can be very scary to employers and managers. And they often push back against it and try to control it or try to contain it. So we need to recognize in this exercise that most employers and managers prefer to have control to make whatever decisions they want in the workplace. And this is true even if they see some value in workers' ideas or opinions. There is a limit often to how much control employers are willing to give over in exchange for those opinions. Because workplaces are generally set up as authoritarian places where you can be fired or, like my dad was, suspended for not doing what your boss tells you to do, or for speaking out against your boss. In Canada, we live in a political democracy where citizens, all of us here, have certain rights, but these rights often do not follow the worker into the workplace. And over the past decades, our society has come to see that a lack of workplace democracy is a problem. And we've developed labor law in our system of liberal political democracy to address that problem or that gap in democracy. And for the most part, that means that labor law has sought to raise the power of workers to better balance that of the power of employers, though ultimately I think people would agree that employers still retain power, more power in the workplace. So Richard, if you don't mind going to the next slide, we have created a system of worker voice in Canada, and there are other different systems in other parts of the world. So there are lots of different options to choose from. In Ontario and Canada, the dominant model to support genuine worker voice is what we call the Wagner model of collective bargaining. And it's named after the policymaker in the United States. His name is Robert Wagner Sr., who actually wrote the law that legalized unions and collective bargaining in the US. And that law became the model for Canadian law as well. So that's why we call it the Wagner model. And the Wagner model says that workers can achieve representational voice in their workplaces by forming a union. And the union is legally entitled to engage in negotiation with the employer about the terms and conditions of work. And the employer is legally bound to engage in those negotiations in good faith, is the terminology. So the employer has to come to the table willing to negotiate. And so this law actually, or this model actually ensures that workers' views are received, considered, and to some degree acted upon, because collective bargaining produces a mutually agreed upon document called the collective agreement, which sets out the rules for all the workers in that union. And the law also allows workers to engage in collective action, like going on strike, if the employer doesn't listen or act or respond to the voice to the desired degree that the workers would like. So that model is actually pretty great for those who can access it. But the Wagner model has some problems. It's built on a system of majority. So to get a union at your workplace, you need to have 50% plus one, so 51% of the workers in that workplace to vote for the union. And if you don't achieve that threshold, the workers have nothing. It's an all or nothing situation, like our electoral process. So that means the workers are bereft of a right to collective voice in that workplace, even if 49% of them really would like to have a say and would like to have a say through a union. They can't have one if the majority don't vote for it. The Wagner model is also built on a system of kind of one workplace, one union. There are some exceptions to that, but it's the dominant model. And that doesn't fit very well with a lot of contemporary workers. You heard Ms. Wright say the workplace is changing, and that's very true. We have more workers who move around a lot from job to job or have different employers within the same sector. And under the Wagner model, workers essentially lose their rights at one workplace when they leave and then have to hope for rights at the next workplace where they go, or maybe they have to advocate for and create new rights at that workplace when they go. And it can be really hard for a majority of workers to vote for a union. Many employers are hostile to the idea of unions because they give over a lot of control, and workers are really afraid of retaliation. It's also hard just logistically to get workers together and all decide to vote for a union when maybe they have different shifts. Maybe some of them are part-time or temporarily employed or precariously employed. These days, many workers work remotely. We don't have the same connection that we do to our colleagues. Larger workplaces, it's harder to get 50% of people on board when you've got thousands of workers, for instance. So forming a union is not easy, and sometimes it takes months or years to do that. Sometimes it takes more than one attempt. We also see that there's been an overall decline in unionization in Canada and in other industrialized countries. And this is particularly true in the private sector, partly because we've seen quite a dramatic decline in the manufacturing sector and the primary industry sector, where unions have been very heavily concentrated. And we've seen a rise in service sector work, both high wage and low wage service sector work, where unions are less represented. So the problem with the Wagner model is that it's inaccessible actually to many contemporary workers. And you see this big caution sign on the slide in front of you, and below that some statistics where we see that only actually 29% of workers in Canada are members of a union. Well, that's not a very high rate. We've never had 100%. We've never even had close to 80%. The highest amount of unionization in Canada was around 45%, really at the heydays of unionization. But now we're less than 1/3. And if you break down that coverage for the private sector and the public sector, we see that the public sector is actually quite heavily unionized, 74%. But in the private sector, it's even lower. I've rounded it up to be generous. It's just under 14%. So we've seen a little uptick of unionization lately. Definitely in my work, I see some game developers who are starting to form unions, and that's an interesting thing to watch. We also see workers like the recent campaigns at Amazon that you might have heard about in the news are forming unions in different spaces. But really, we're unlikely to see the general landscape change without some sort of policy change or intervention. And so if we go just to the last slide now, what we can conclude from that is that there is a voice gap. So we have a representation issue then in the workplace. Many agree that workers have a right to collective voice to create a more even power dynamic with employers and to make workplaces more democratic. And many workers want to express their opinions, to protect themselves, and to advocate for change. And we know, though, that even if employers value the input of their workers, they also want control. And so the power imbalance between employers and workers requires a genuine voice mechanism to ensure that voice is received, considered, and acted upon. But this seems out of reach for most workers in the private sector. Our existing voice mechanisms are perhaps not genuine, because they give too much power in the hands of the employer and are essentially employer-driven. Or, as in the case of unionization under the Wagner model, they're hard to access. Or, like in the example of those joint occupational health and safety committees, they're limited in scope, right? Those committees do deliver genuine voice, but they're constrained to the narrow topic of health and safety at the present moment, at least. So what now, right? This leads us to fundamental questions about the adequacy of current labor and employment laws and about better or alternative models. And these are exactly the questions that your assembly is going to be grappling with over the next day, the next weeks, the next month. Should we reform the Wagner model? Are there ways that we can make changes to that model so that it's easier for workers to form unions in roughly the existing way and just increase access? Can we streamline and speed up some of the processes, lower the requirements for achieving union certification maybe? Should we expand the Wagner model into other forms of unionization, ones that maybe don't require a majority of workers to vote for the union? And there are examples of this around the world. It's sometimes called minority unionism, and it's a model that is active in the United Kingdom. We also see workers at Google in the US and globally are experimenting a little bit with minority unionism to try to achieve representation. We also see models, alternative models, where unions can exist at the occupational level, so across an entire occupational discipline, or across an entire sector at the sectoral level, not workplace by workplace. And good examples of those kinds of models are in the Scandinavian or Nordic countries. So Sweden, for instance, has, I think, the largest union in the world, which seems kind of strange for Sweden because you don't imagine it to be a very large or populous country. But it's because this union covers all white collar workers in Sweden. All of them are in the same union. And so game developers in Sweden would join this white collar union called Unionen. So that's a different way of thinking about it, a different model than we have. Maybe though we want to turn our attention to a different approach that's not rooted in unionism. And maybe we want to say, we like those joint occupational health and safety committees. Can we expand that kind of form of voice? The broader term for committees like that is called co-determination. And Germany, for instance, is a country that has a long history of quite robust co-determination systems where workers have a lot of say at top levels of organizations. Or maybe there are other models out there that are yet to be born, right? Or yet to be formalized, that workers are experimenting with in different spaces, or just need some fresh eyes, like the people in this group, to have a look at things in a different way. So it's very exciting. It's a very exciting time to be having these discussions. I commend you on your interest in this incredibly important topic and your engagement as citizens in this amazing opportunity. I wish you well in your learning and your discovery. And I know that I'm very keen, like Ms. Wright mentioned already, to hear your final reflections. But for now, I'll stop it there, and I'm just happy to take any questions that any of you might have, either using your own voice out of your own mouths or in the chat if you prefer. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Weststar, for sharing your expertise with us and setting the table for our rest of our learning today. I do want to echo that we can open the floor to any members who have questions. Please feel free to raise your Zoom hand or type in the chat, and we'll make sure that we call on you. We have a good 10 minutes set aside. Let me see if we have any. So I see Denise and Tracy 1-2 with questions. Denise, please go ahead.
We can't hear you, Denise.
Denise, we're not hearing you yet, although it seems like you're off mute.
Sorry, I'm confused with two screens. I'm not sure if I missed this, but is there a reason why there's been such a decrease in unionization? Like, why is it so hard for people to join unions, or is there, are they reluctant to join unions? Like, why has there been such a decrease?
Yeah, thanks, Denise. It's an excellent question and one that we could probably talk about for days, but I'll try to give you a few of the kind of primary drivers maybe in the shift. So one of the major differences is that unions were really concentrated in what we might consider generally as sort of blue collar work in manufacturing and also in primary industry. That's where unions kind of historically started. And Ontario had a lot of that. We had a lot of manufacturing. We're really kind of a heartland of manufacturing for a time. But with changes in the world, global economic space, globalization, we see a lot of the manufacturing has moved offshore to other places that tend to be places where you can make things more cheaply because of labor costs. And the manufacturing that we have has shrunk. There's also been technological change that means that you can do the same kind of manufacturing work with not the same degree of labor. And so that has resulted just in itself in a decrease of unionization because unions have been concentrated in that space and then not shifted into new spaces. We're seeing unions more and more to start shifting into new spaces, but historically work in the service industry or the service sector has been a little bit harder to unionize. Because at the low wage end of the service sector, we see a lot more turnover in workers. We see sometimes workers who are passing in and out of service sector jobs on their way to and from other places sometimes. And so that's a harder group to unionize and to bring together to fight for rights in a particular workplace if you're thinking you might only be in that workplace for a short amount of time. At the higher wage end of the service sector, we also see kind of gaps in unionization because that's things like finance and IT, where workers a little bit themselves have seen themselves as kind of more individualistic, as professionals who maybe don't require a union because unions are still sometimes associated with that blue collar space. But we're seeing some changes there too with, for instance, video game developers and others. So those are some of the kind of broad trends. We see ups and downs in the laws as well. Sometimes it's been easier to form unions in Ontario where you could just sign a union card. You didn't have to have a vote of workers. And so that eliminated a step in the process and made it easier. And often we see unionization rates kind of bump up when there's a more favorable legal environment, but that sort of comes and goes depending on the government in power. So there are lots of different things. I wouldn't say that there's been like a cultural shift that workers just don't like unions anymore. There's still, quite a high interest in them. It's more of an access issue.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
I'm going to move next to Tracy, and then I do see that we have two great questions in the chat from Dandy and Claire. So Tracy, please go ahead, and then we'll get to our chat questions.
Hi, Joanna. Thanks for joining us this morning. I'm a little jaded when it comes to unions. I've been in many different unions. I'm currently an educational assistant in lovely Bill 124.
Yep.
And so they've taken away our right to legal bargaining. We've just getting it back for this bargaining session, but I know in my workplace, I've worked in grocery stores, I've worked in a lot of retail, that kind of thing. And I think there's a very negative condemnation sometimes when it comes to unions, especially in the public sector. Teachers' unions are bashed constantly. As an educational assistant, we are non-existent in the world. Do you think that there's a better way? Because I know with unions, it's really hard. The government, for example, says all these wonderful things, and then they bash the unions. So is there another way to kind of make it more positive and make people want to join unions and want to get help? Because right now I know working in the public sector and a lot of my friends see unions in a really negative light. I mean, they're trying to bring in a new union into my work right now for the lunchroom supervisors and the travel assistants because they're only paid minimum wage at the board level. And we're fighting like cats and dogs, but nobody wants to join anymore. Sorry, I'm long-winded.
No, and I think it's great to hear your experiences, and I'm sure you guys will get to know each other pretty well over this. And these firsthand experiences really matter, right? I agree with you that unions has been kind of associated with a bad word sometimes for some workers, right? Almost the knee-jerk response when you hear it is that, oh, this is sort of a disloyal thing to be a part of a union. It's a negative thing, and definitely employers, even though our legal system says that people have the right to join unions, and even though Canada has, signed on to declarations at the International Labor Organization to say that workers should have the fundamental right to collective bargaining, we still have kind of the dominant narrative about unions that comes from that more unitarist or that more managerial perspective that sort of try to paint unions as troublemakers. Part of that problem is that the general public often only hears about the work that unions do when they're doing something adversarial or militant, right? When do we hear about unions? Well, it's when workers are on the picket line. Do we hear about all the moments when unions, as representational groups of workers are actually, you know, engaged in really good dialogue within workplaces to solve problems and to come up with good solutions. No, that never makes the news, right? So that is an issue, right? That we have this kind of problematic narrative, and some workers have had negative experiences in unions themselves, because unions are really just made up of the people who belong to them, and so they're only as good as the people who belong to them. And definitely unions have gotten themselves into hot places historically, just the same as employers have as well. So there is, you know, really this kind of mixed landscape, but fundamentally it's you know, unfair to kind of bash unions of the public sector. It's fundamentally problematic to have a narrative where we say that, oh, well, public sector workers get everything because their unions are super greedy. Let's take those rights away. I think what we'd rather do is say, those are really good rights and privileges over there. Let's extend them to more people. And, you know, maybe that requires a change in the narrative, but definitely, Tracy, I acknowledge that that is a hurdle towards unionization, is this kind of veil of negativity around that kind of adversarial experience that unions can set up in the workplace, for sure.
And also, Joanna, we're not allowed to speak about all those negative things, or I mean, the positive things. Part of the rules of the union is you're not allowed to talk about anything collective outside of your group. So that's why nobody's allowed to hear about all the wonderful things too, because we're not in our business anyways, we're not allowed to talk about that stuff.
That's interesting, because I don't see a reason why you shouldn't be able to, but.
Thanks so much, Tracy. We have a couple of minutes left, and I'm gonna see if we can get to the question from Claire that was in the chat. Is there truth to the idea that union activity only occurs in workplaces where workers feel taken advantage of, i.e., e.g., happy work employees don't unionize? Can you comment on that? And I just want to see, I see a few more hands raised. If we run out of time, I invite you to put your questions in the chat, and we'll ask if Johanna can respond to them after we move on.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond in text after, and I'll try also to be less long-winded. Claire, it's a great point. Often you need a trigger, right? So if workers are really happy and workers are feeling like they have a lot of say, they have a lot of agency, they're doing their work, their employer is responsive to their needs, they probably won't think to unionize. So usually you do need kind of a trigger of dissatisfaction to kick off that kind of cascade towards unionization. But the idea, I don't think it's true to say that happy employees don't unionize. I think that's part of this idea of unions as being a disloyal act. What I hear from game developers in particular is, I love this work. I want this work to be better, so I'd like to unionize because of that. I'd like to have more voice, more say because of that. So there can be a positive cycle as well. But usually in practice, there is kind of a negative trigger that is involved. A thwarting of the voice is required in order for workers to seek out more.
Thanks so much, Johanna. I'm going to quickly give Dennis the last question. I see your hand is raised. If you can just make it quick, Dennis, and then again, I'll invite anyone to put their questions further into the chat, and we'll keep going. So Dennis, go right ahead.
Okay, my comment is there is a difference between public sector and private sector. The public sector is paid by the general public who want the services. The private sector is run by the economics of running the company. So that is perhaps the reason why unions are less accepted in private sector, if you know what I mean. They are trying to make a profit for their shareholders. So I don't think there is one solution for all of these. We can't have just one solution. It's got to be multiple solutions. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Dennis, for sure. And governments themselves do play a little bit more of a societal or kind of moral role model, right? So the fact that the government does have laws that support unionization mean that feels a little better that the public sector also then has unions. Whereas, as you say, with the private sector being much more profit motivated, employers there would see unions as adding to their cost, right? Adding labor costs, and then would likely be a little bit more aggressive towards unions or unionization in those spaces. Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much, Dennis and Professor Weststar. Let me just thank you one more time for sharing your expertise with us. Not only giving us, I think, a deeper understanding of some of the concepts at stake here, but also providing us, the Assembly members here, with a bit more of the language that I think will come in handy as they continue their discussions, especially, around creating and reforming voice mechanisms and identifying the voice gap in what it means to each of our members. So I'd invite all of our members to keep some of those concepts in mind as we transition into our discussions for the rest of the day.